Shalom Aleichem, welcome. Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here today at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts, where you're joining us in our live audience, and to those of you on our online Zoom, welcome to you. It's great to have you all here today on a beautiful summer day. For today's program, Dual Identities, Living in Meier's Shadow, with Arthur M. Horwitz. The program, as I mentioned, is being presented both live and online. So a few little details to go over before we get started. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom today, your audio and your video will be turned off throughout the program. You may send questions to us via the question panel, which in most instances is lower right of your screen. We ask that you keep questions short and refrain from comments so that we can get to all the questions this afternoon. I want to give a quick shout out before we get started to thank our violinist, which was a lovely accompaniment and prelude to this afternoon's talk, Julie Ludwig Oberlin. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to introduce Arthur Horwitz. Arthur is a journalist, civic leader who served as publisher and executive editor of Detroit Jewish News for more than 30 years. A former paperboy, copyboy, reporter, and bureau chief for New Haven's daily newspapers, Arthur is a graduate of University of Connecticut and the Yale School of Management. I'm also proud to announce and share that he is on our board of directors and a wonderful supporter and enthusiast for the work of the center, and we appreciate that on his behalf. It's a pleasure to welcome Arthur to the stage. Please join me in welcoming him for what I know will be quite an afternoon talk. Following the talk, just to mention, we'll be in conversation, and then we'll open this up to both questions in the audience here and online. And then please follow us upstairs to our museum bookstore out front, where books will be on sale, and Arthur is available to sign them. For those of you online, you may purchase your copy at shop.yiddishbookcenter.org. Join me in welcoming Arthur.
Good afternoon. Lisa, thank you so much for that generous introduction here in Massachusetts. In addition to thanking Lisa, I also want to offer thanks to the amazing Yiddish Book Center staff, whose president is Susan Bonson. And also, I want to take note of the board that Lisa mentioned, chaired by Ira Wagner, that I've been honored to be a part of since 2012. And also what I'd like to do, since I'm in this particular room, is called the Applebaum-Dreiker Auditorium. Both Eugene Applebaum and Eugene Dreiker, of blessed memory, were from Detroit. Were very, very significant players in Jewish and secular life in Detroit. And very, very important, and particularly Eugene Dreiker, to this institution. So it's an extra special honor to be here in this particular room for two people who I view as mentors when I was in Detroit and still am in Detroit. I also want to point out a couple of friends who are here from Connecticut, and our violinist, Julie Overland, a childhood friend of my wife's from New Hampshire. So thank you. Mischief making. Practically from the time I could walk, I was getting into trouble, swiping or breaking stuff, somehow rolling my father's 1952 Ford Fairlane out of a garage, or bandit by the age of 3. And by the way, I was not a Brooklyn Dodger fan. We got that at a discount department store in West Haven, Connecticut. I was. What's your name, little boy? A customer at the nearby A&P demanded to know after I swept rows of canned vegetables from an eye-level shelf. Already don't Horwitz. No room for Meier, Meier in Hebrew, as my middle name. At least not yet. By the time I started kindergarten in New Haven, I had graduated to eavesdrop on my mother's kitchen table conversations about the Holocaust from inside a closet, or lying down in a bathtub with the curtains drawn What can I say? I was curious. A very young journalist in the making? Perhaps. However, what I heard was not meant for a child's ears. Sala, Finkelstein Horwitz desperately wanted to be more American, to learn and converse in English, not Yiddish, to play mahjong, not endless guerrilla games of cards. Boy, could they play cards. To read painstakingly the same books as her neighbors. Her American-born friends had questions, and she had some answers in accented English that I could understand. The air was filled with the 2-pack-a-day haze of Marlboros, Winstons, and Parliaments, neat, clean, quarter-inch, taglines. And from my listening posts, I was unknowingly inhaling a different kind of secondhand smoke. Stories that were punctuated by beatings, hangings, degradations, and starvation. There were no warning labels. I had become addicted to hearing her narratives. My New Haven-born father, Morton, was mostly away from home, enslaved to the store, his small dry good business, squeezed awning to awning along one narrow roadway, Legion Avenue, with Jewish butchers and bakers and delis and grocers and clothing alteration shops and laundromats, many employing recently arrived Yiddish-speaking survivors. Lacking his presence or filter, almost every day for me had become a version of Holocaust remembrance day. Unsurprisingly, I acted out. Sweeping cans off store shelves gave way to petty acts of vandalism or theft. For some of my friends here, they only know it as the angel, not today. By 1967, with my bar mitzvah approaching, I had graduated from being an elementary school bandit to a junior high school chutzpahnik in Ganef. This is a photo of my little brother Meier. This is who you are named for. My mother insisted. It showed a little boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, arms thrust upward, face etched with fear, forever framed with a menacing German rifleman. The image had filled a cracked and discolored plastic sleeve in her wallet. My brother Len, sister Lori, and I were his sleeve mates. Full-color mini portraits displaying smirks and smiles. But I already knew it was an iconic photo from the 1943 liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto, not my ear. In fact, she had no photos of any of her family members to prove that they ever existed. With the intent of swiping $1 or $2, I wasn't gone for long. I had instead popped her bubble of fantasy. No, it's not, she insisted. Yes, it is. No, it's not. Yes, it is. No, it's not. No, it's not, I insisted. We went back and forth. We had this big jumble of an argument until her final emphatic declaration. This is a photo of my little brother, Meier. This is who you are named for. And from that point forward, she saddled me with the burden and responsibility of living 2 lives, mine and the one little Meier never had. Doing so would shape my life, my family, and my media career. Reality and fantasy. Let's go back to where the blurring of reality and fantasy began. My mother's Polish hometown on September 3rd, 1939. On that day, Germany's army captured Zwolle and most of its 10,000 residents, about 40% of them Jewish. In addition to my mother, who was 11 years old, her household included her parents, Leib and Esther, her grandmother, Rachel, who lived with them, and 4 siblings, Manya, Franya, Leah, and the youngest, the boy, Meier. As the Germans began separating Jewish men and boys from the Jewish women and girls, Leib grabbed 6-year-old Meier, the apple of my mother's eye, and hid at a nearby farm. The woman stayed behind. Soon thereafter, my mother was forced into slave labor, digging ditches, harvesting potatoes, washing floors, and performing other back-breaking labor for almost 3 years, until in the early fall of 1942, the situation changed drastically. Zwolin's Jews were herded to the town square and forced to march 9 miles to a railroad siding lined with boxcars. There, they joined thousands of Jews from other parts of the Radom district. From this huddled mass of humanity, a German officer demanded my mother step forward. Panicked, her own mother pushed Franja forward to the German as well, with the following whispered instructions. Go with her. She will not be able to wash her hair alone. Those would be the last words they'd ever hear from their mother. Together, Franja and Sala joined 15 other young women for a forced march to a nearby slave labor farm where they were harvesting potatoes. Shockingly, their sister Manya was already there, having escaped an earlier smaller roundup. But they couldn't escape hearing the night's piercing screams echoing from the railroad siding. Rachel, Esther, and Leah were among those heading to the Treblinka extermination camp. After the harvest, my mother and sister survived another selection and were sent to the Skarżyska Kamena concentration camp, a former Polish munitions factory now serving the needs of the Germans. On January 15, 1945, the day of her liberation by the Red Army, she was 16 years old, stood about 5 feet 6 inches tall, by the way, had size 10 feet still, and weighed less than 70 pounds. What kept my mother going? The fantasy of reuniting with her father and her little brother, but it was not to be. She discovered they had been turned over to the Germans and killed. A small band of Jewish refugees, including my mother, Franja, and Manya, crossed mountains and multiple borders to reach a displaced persons camp in the American zone of occupation in Germany, where they would remain for about 4 years. While there, they learned of the mass murder of much of European Jewry. Among the victims were 91 family members whose names my mother could still recite decades later, only 6, including my mother and the 2 sisters from her family and extended family survived. A sponsor in New Haven was eventually found for my mother as well as Manya and her husband Leon Glick and their infant daughter Esther. They arrived in July of 1949 with little more than the clothes on their back. A few months later, after starting a job as a counter clerk on Legion Avenue, a kosher bakery, my mother attracted the attention of a nearby storekeeper. Guess who? A date awaited for my mother with Arthur Horwitz. But first, he had to pass muster with Manya's husband, Meier. As my father later recalled, he stood at the doorway, unsure whether I could be trusted. After a moment of my talking to him in Yiddish, he cut me off with a wave of his hand, and in the most broken English I ever heard responded, "Please speak you, me, English, no, better, English, no, speak English." He couldn't understand the Litvak accent that I didn't even know I had. However, my father passed muster. The date with Sally was a success, and 6 months later, she won the Grina jackpot, marrying an American. My brother Len was born in 1951, my sister Lori in 1958. I arrived in 1954, and 8 days after my birth, Thus, at my breast, I received Meier's Hebrew. Listen to my mother's words from this 1979 video testimony about her deceased family in expectation for her own children.
I see my father walking with my little brother, or walking. I used to love to walk with him Saturdays in the fields. He used to show me things and explain things to me. Well, my little brother was very good, even being 6 years old. He was carving things. Well, my little sister was holding on to my mother. She's a beautiful little blonde girl. It's 100. Oh, my grandmother, we're very, very close to my grandmother. She was in her 80s. She never would tell us how old she was. She was always with us, and we just adored her. I always used to talk about my grandmother more than my mother, because she was always there. And of course, sometimes the holidays, mainly Yom Kippur, seem to leave a very big impression with me, because they seem to be so very holy. And my aunts, so many aunts and uncles, were very close family, and little cousins. Nobody's left. And my house was always full of people, because always coming, because my grandmother was with us, so everybody was coming to my house. And so I always think about those people. I don't have any pictures of them, and I wish I could draw. My oldest son once came very close to draw the picture of my father. Pretty good. But, you fear, you just, I don't know, maybe I feel guilty that I'm here and they are not. Who knows? And then always wonder about my little brother from my father, because the two of them were together. You always say, how did they die? What happened? And here I am, and I did have the children, because I always said, if that's what Hitler would want to, we shouldn't have any children, or we shouldn't just disappear. So my children are named after my father, my brother, my mother, my sister. And it seems I lived through my children the things what I hope my little brother would be, maybe, or my sister. And I'm scared.
Reality and fantasy intertwined. Living through her children. Arthur living for Meier. The burden, responsibility, and feelings of inadequacy were continuing to suffocate me, like the stories of death and despair I inhaled as an eavesdropping young child. I resented them then. I just tried to ignore it. Desperate to protect myself, I put up a shield. When it came to Meier, I had conditioned myself and show no emotion, to feel no pain. I was told repeatedly that no pain I ever experienced could match that endured by my mother and my mother. And so it went for decades. However, despite my best efforts, I could still feel pains of Meier's presence. On my wedding day, my wife Gina, on the births of her children, on my Yale acceptance, and on choosing the Detroit Jewish News over the Baltimore Sun. It felt like he was watching, wanting to be a part of my life's journey. As my parents' health began to decline, Gina and I convinced them in 2005 to move closer to us in Michigan, so we could help take care of them. I did so knowing that it would lead to more frequent motherly Meier encounters, and believing my protective shield would still remain intact. After a few years, my mother's physical and mental health rapidly declined, and she passed in 2014. My father passed in 2016. She was 86, he 94. What to keep? What to toss? 2 years after my father's passing, I was finally ready to begin exploring the great unknown of my parents' saved stuff. A shoebox, size 10, big shoebox, caught my attention. I removed its lid, half expecting to find long expired coupons or unredeemed S&H green stamp books. Instead, I discovered a wallet. The wallet. Still tucked in his plastic sleeves were the school mugshots of my brother, sister, and me, and joining us was the cropped, partially crinkled, but bogus image of Meier. Mugshots of my brother, sister, and me, to the left. Faux Meier photo to the right in the garbage bin. At that moment, there was no hesitation, no regret, no more living for two. I could finally live my own life. Or so I thought. Are you going to do it? Gina asked. I had been contacted by Michigan's Settlement Holocaust Center in early 2021 to join 20 other Detroit area children of survivors. For months of training that would empower us to share our own stories with the tens of thousands of students who are visiting the center annually. With fewer survivors available to provide eyewitness accounts, we, their children, were being asked to step up. I wasn't so sure. I worried that saying yes to participating would force me to lower my shield, to show emotion, to feel pain as I excavated, shaped, and shared my own buried story. I retreated into our home study, closed the double doors, and stared at a sealed banker's box beneath the table. I opened it and discovered letters from the 1980s and 1990s that my mother had saved from New Haven area middle school and high school students following her own Holocaust survivor presentations. Here's a sampling of what I read. Mrs. Horwitz, hearing your story has made the history of the Holocaust more of a reality for me. There's no way I can ever fully understand the way you must have felt having experienced this at such a young age, even knowing you were not much older than myself. Mrs. Horwitz, you showed me things I could never imagine could happen. I realize now that it's up to us, the newer generation, and for the people who survived the Holocaust, to let others know what happened so we can prevent this from ever happening again. Mrs. Horwitz, I hope you can find happiness in it. I emerged from the study. I have made my decision. I'll do it. I am fine. Because of the common bond children of survivors in the group shared and the sensitive instruction and gentle coaxing we received from Holocaust Center educators, I found a safe place for personal story exploration. I discovered poetry as a pathway for illuminating some of the darkest places in my memory and expressing feelings of understanding and love toward my mother and Meier, my namesake. Frayed and folded into love, massaged by the caress of fumbling fingers, wrinkled like the familiar folds of her grandmother's face. This is a photo of Meier. This is who you are named for. But it wasn't. It showed a little boy, all right, maybe 6 or 7 years old, with arms thrust upward, rosy cheeks, radiant smile, twinkling eyes, perhaps once, but not now. This is a photo of Meier. This is who you were named for. It wasn't. Hopes and dreams, reality and fantasy, irrevocably intertwined. Please join me. Hear the crackle of the electrified fence, blend sordid scenes of inhumanity through an otherwise enveloping fog. See that girl over there? Gaunt, beaten, bored, starving. It's not me, she said. It was. Hopes and dreams, reality and fantasy, irrevocably intertwined. Jettison the burden, relieve the responsibility, give up the guilt. I just want to be me. Yet I must live for two. This is a photo of Meier. This is who you are named for. Indeed, it is. With the aid of scissors and a photocopying machine, I carefully snipped an image of the little boy from a book and slipped it into my own wallet. A few weeks later, it had a sleeve make. While nibbling on a Trader Joe black and white cookie at my parents' old gray table that was now our kitchen for cooking, my grandson Michael pulled a card from his Pokemon deck and he pushed it to me. You'll need this for good luck, Saba. As I placed it in my wallet, he noticed the photographed image. What's that? I paused to catch my breath. That's my mother's little brother, Meier. That's what I'm made for. Really? Micah asked. Yes, it is. Fantasy and reality irrevocably intertwined for at least another generation. Identities living in Meier's shadow removes filters previously inhibiting children of survivors, known as 2Gs, from sharing our own unvarnished growing up in America stories. Fellow 2Gs here, or who are watching, it's time to remove those inhibitions. With the help of our children and communities, we need to dig deeper, even when it's painful to do so, to tell our stories, make sure they are heard. Now more than ever, they are needed in the incessant battle against Jew hatred, Holocaust revisionism, and denial. Our stories will undergird the truths of our parents, the eyewitnesses to the ultimate crime against humanity. They will inspire and empower our children, the 3Gs, third generation survivors, to continue the fight. The oldest among children of survivors are now entering their 9th decade. Time is running out on them and on our generation. We must write our stories. As the simple and age-old rabbinic saying asks, if not now, when? Thank you again for allowing me to share this snapshot of my dual identity story with you. And I look forward, Lisa, to your questions, and to any questions that you on the live stream maybe send this.
Thank you. It's quite something to hear that in person. I've read the book, and there's a lot there, so I'm very eager to ask you some questions to get us started. For those of you who are in online, I know some of you had trouble with the audio, but that was fixed, so hopefully you'll be able to send your questions along. So Arthur, I wanted to start, if I may, by asking you, it's a very personal story. It's a memoir. You come to this both as the son of a survivor and also a journalist. How hard was it in terms of telling the story and, if I may, that dual identity?
I think, Lisa, one of the things that as a journalist you're trained to do is to listen. But mostly you're listening to other people's stories. You're trying to keep yourself out of the narrative. And one of the challenges here was when I realized that maybe I had something to say. How could I take the journalist out of myself and dig deeper, drill down, expose myself in the ways that even people who I had interviewed rarely did? So that was that first challenge. And I guess you could say that was the first challenge in terms of a dual identity. But after that, what I realized is I had multiple stories that I could tell. So dual identities could be as the child of a Holocaust survivor mother and American-born father, dual identities. As a journalist who happened to be Jewish, because I was in secular journalism for years, and a Jewish journalist. Even as somebody who grew up in New Haven and possesses a degree from Yale, there was this town-gown tension that existed probably since Yale moved to New Haven from Saybrook in, I think, 1710 or 1711. So there are all of these dual identities. And what I needed to do was to whittle it down to what at the core was the dual identity, that I could write about uniquely, but also that maybe could have a longer lasting message for children of survivors. And that's how I was able to zero in on that memory of the photo in my mother's wallet that she had cut out, and to make that both the central theme line in the story, the visual that my guess is most people here and who are watching live stream are familiar with that photo. And besides the initial shock that people have when they first say, oh, so that's your mother's little brother. No, it's not. But carrying that all the way through.
I have to ask you, at what point did you realize, not only for you again personally, was this a story you wanted to tell, but knowing that it's important for all of us to remember that we need to know this story because it's impacting a second generation. You know, there were all the language and cultural issues that we address here at the Yiddish Book Center about what that next generation was like and how you carry things forward. So for you, was there a moment when you realized, okay, this is more than just telling this story? It's also encouraging and understanding for all of us to work through this.
When I was first starting to share the idea of the dual identity story that you see in the book, and talking with other children of survivors, the first wave of feedback I had was nobody's really talked as children of survivors about their own stories the way that you have in this manuscript when it was a manuscript, as well as it was when it became a book. But I have to say there were two other kind of pop culture data points that pushed me more to want to get this out for children of survivors and their children with refugees. One was the movie that Jesse Eisenberg had put out that many of you hopefully have seen. A good movie. In fact, I think the best supporting actor for, I keep calling him Macaulay Culkin's brother, but you see how tuned in I am to the pop culture per se. But in that entire movie, there were no parents, there were no children of survivors in that story. It was a grandmother passed away, left some money, and two cousins go and they go on this tour. And when I looked at who was in that group, there was one person who maybe could have filled the bill as a 2G, and that was the Jennifer Grey character, who was mostly an afterthought character. And when I looked at her, she reminded me of other children of survivors who probably were in therapy for a long time and were just trying to come into terms. So that pop culture thing really stood out. And then there was a story not long after that in the New York Times, a 3G, her first name was Taffy, fairly well known. I think I remember the last name, Taffy. How can they forget Taffy, right? I listened to the audio of it. It was very, very good. It was about 42 minutes long, and I clocked about 35 or 36 seconds in that where there was any reference to these people that she was talking to and talking about having parents. So it was at that point where I said, you know, we're going to lose our stories. People aren't asking us. We feel we're not justified to kind of put another overlay onto our parents' stories because we knew they weren't all heroes. They did heroic things, but they were people living tough lives in a new country, and we were, in many cases, their experiments, especially the oldest among children of survivors. And that story can't be lost. So I'm hoping this book helps in many ways to draw that in.
That's interesting because I imagine for you there's a responsibility in how you tell the story, how you approach it, and even to understanding what the questions are, because you haven't been given a toolkit for this. You, I think, as a second generation, if I may, are really trying to explore what that impact was for you. How do you inform that story? How do you ask those questions? Speak a little bit about those aspects of this.
I mean, I mentioned in the book, and I also in the presentation, that for decades I tried to ignore. I tried not to deal with it. I stuck my head out once, I guess, or up out of the gopher hole or whatever it would be, and that was in 1979. And during that time, Helen Epstein had come out with her book, Children of the Holocaust, which was monumental. There was a TV series called The Holocaust. Holocaust was starting to get attention. There was a panel put together in New Haven at the JCC by somebody who was actually well known to the book center here, Sam Casso, as the moderator, a young professor, very young professor, who was from New Haven, who was part of our Gurina. His family was part of our Gurina circle. There were 4 panelists. I was one of them. Being a journalist, I said, I'll just lay back. I mean, I'm not going to volunteer or anything. The other 3 were all children of survivors, plural. I was the only one children of a survivor. By the time they shared their stories and they got to me, I said, I'm having a hard time relating to you. Because I had an American-born father. On Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, I sat between my father and my grandfather. My pediatrician was my father's first cousin. The guy who put me in my first, who put me in my first Buster Brown shoes was my grandfather's brother, Abe, my Uncle Abe, if you will. So rather than have that be a moment where I was feeling empowered, I said any pain that I felt, as I mentioned, any pain couldn't match the pain that my mother or her little brother felt. At that point, I felt any pain I had as a child of 1 survivor couldn't match the pain of 2, and I pretty much shut down on even addressing that subject. So it was really only later on, and I'm looking at my own children, but especially my grandchildren. And Micah, who I mentioned, who loves his black and white Trader Joe's cookies. We have those in Detroit too, by the way. And when he gave me his Pokemon card, it was at that point that there's this realization, and it actually made for a good tie together for the story, is this is intergenerational. Some call it intergenerational transmission of trauma, etc. But what I did in writing that book in part was so that his siblings, his cousins, etc., would know not just my mother's story vis-a-vis my father, and of course, story of their Saba, and not Zadie, Saba, Gina's bucket. She didn't look like, maybe I do look like it, Saba, whatever. But there was that recognition that I needed to voice this before I too kick into that point in my life where I might not be able to let this in.
I wanted to ask you, how long did you wrestle with, or maybe not wrestle with, the idea of writing the book? I mean, did it sit with you for a while, or did it just prompt itself as, I need to do this?
The book did not start out as what it became, because I avoided that subject. So it's COVID time, right? Early 2021. Gina said, do something, get busy or whatever. No, she would say that. She wouldn't say that at all. And I was starting to look at that Yale-New Haven dynamic, because a lot has been written about it by academicians. God knows how many PhD dissertations have been written about it. New Haven was a model city and redevelopment. Yale School of Architecture was behind it. Yale was the home of the American Eugenics Society. Charles Lindbergh was their hero. America's first movement started in New Haven by Yaleys. So there was this whole Yale-New Haven dynamic, and how I, living on both sides of the fence, town and gown. And I shared it with an initial editor, friend, and she said something that really resonated. She said to me, you know what, you have the makings of a good story. The question is, do you want potentially a great story? Because if you do, you have to dig deep. And you are not digging deep. You're like a reporter. You are like a journalist. You're giving footnotes and all of those kinds of things. And it was after that kick in the toughest, if I can call it that I went back and I realized, just as we talked at the outset, of these dual identities, these multiple dual identities, this is the one that I need to pursue. And I worked backward. I said, what's the message I want at the end? How do I work toward that? Keep the anecdotes, keep the things that need to be there, but suddenly things that were maybe, I don't call them superfluous, but not quite as important to the main storyline. That's like, okay, that maybe someday will be for another book. And it's almost like there's a path that started to emerge. I don't want to sound biblical. I don't want to sound like, the parting of the Red Sea. I'm just going to keep going, right? That's how I got on that path.
Yeah, it's a question I ask a lot of writers, which is, was there then a moment when it sort of synthesized itself for you? Is there one part where it just, I get it. I get where that, we circle back to the question of the dual identity, and also you telling a personal story, also being a journalist. And as you said, what this editor suggested to you is you have to go deeper. Was there something that propelled you in that direction?
Well, I think I always carried that, I'll call it a scar from 1979 when I was on that panel, where I was maybe ready to start to talk about my experience until I heard the other experiences and just how much more powerful they seem. And I think we all know, and children of survivors who here know, that everyone has his or her own story. They're all unique. And as I said, I had pretty much shut that down. But but bringing that back up more to when I ultimately decided it was time to break through is after I went through that box and my mother's saved stuff, some of her saved stuff, and I saw the letters. And by the way, most of the letters that I mentioned were from St. Mary's junior high school in New Haven. So this wasn't some Jewish high school or middle school. My mother, growing up in Poland, public school, as she reminded us, was Catholic school. So she was 11, a little over 11 when the war started. So she was the same age as many of these girls that she'd be presenting to. And when I read that, and I saw one in particular that I used that talked about we, the new generation, need to be speaking up. Well, that was 45 years ago, or 35 to 45 years ago. And so there were like these messages that were pushing me, were continuing to move me along. Because for me, maybe there are other writers here or listening in or watching, where it's a straight line. You just go, you say, okay, it's 8 in the morning, I'm going to write until 4 in the afternoon. I'm going to do it 5 days a week. I'm going to do whatever. For me, I could start writing in the next morning when I'm done with a particular thought. On another day, I can say, okay, I'm going to devote X amount of time, and I'm stuck on a few adjectives. What's the real correct word for this moment, this situation? So really, in that regard, though, it was that particular, trigger, if I can call it that moved me forward when I read through those letters and realized that new generation was now not so new, and the situation was not necessarily getting any better. In fact, it was getting worse.
This may be a good time to open it up to the audience. I'm going to ask for those who are here in the live audience, when you ask your question, if you can be as loud as you can with asking it so everybody can hear, and we'll try to repeat some of the questions as needed. So let's start with the audience here at the center, and then I will also field some of these questions online. Anyone want to get started? Okay. Yeah, in the back.
So the question is, as a third generation Holocaust survivor, mother was a survivor, what would you be teaching your children I think before you move forward, you take a half a step backward. I don't know if are your parents still alive. If you haven't done it yet, what I would suggest is have a conversation with her about her unique life, not your mother remembering her parents who came over after the war or that, but rather mom, Ima, what was it like growing up in a household with survivors? How did you, when it came to this time in your life, how did you relate to them? How did you find out? Were they open about what they had to say? Did you learn about your family, our family, through hearing it from others who are more likely to talk? Because one thing, my mother's video that we showed earlier was one of the first 4 that were ever documented by Yale's Fortunoff Video Archive, one of the first 4 ever done anywhere in the world in May of 1979. Steve Nairn, who is the director of Fortunoff, said there are probably about 100,000 videos that have been made since. I would venture to say, without getting into what the proper, video or whatever the medium might be, how many videos or capturing of stories of 2Gs, of your parents' generation, are there? And that will probably provide as much value and benefit, maybe even more in certain ways, than what you orally will be able. Just like when I see my mother talk, when a few people here knew my mother, see her talk, and those words come out of her mouth, they have special resonance. So that, I think, if you wanted to lead something in some way that captured 3Gs, interviewing, talking to the project that captures those 2G stories, will benefit your children and their children.
I'm going to ask you one from our online audience. The double identity is one being North American and the other being Jewish, question mark. Were you doubling between oneself and the other as a child?
I think for me, when I look at my identity, I don't know that I ever looked at myself as a North American per se. I think what's important, and I present to children at the Holocaust Center, I mentioned, part of my training was because in Michigan 10 years ago, the law was signed that mandated Holocaust and genocide, Armenian genocide education, and you had hundreds of thousands of kids come through. So when it comes to talking with children and talking about American, see, I don't necessarily factor in this context Canada and the United States. What I factor into, what I tell the children is, I want you to understand these people, my mother, that little band of survivors, they knew one thing. And this is after my mother went back to her hometown looking for her family, and she was chased out of her hometown because they were threatening to kill her. Okay? You go where the Americans are. That was the message that my mother said. We knew if we went where the Americans were, which was the German, Soviet zone and British zone, American zone, you'll be safe there. You might not have everything that you want. In fact, you shouldn't expect it. But after everything that they went through, they knew you go where the Americans are. And I point to these 13, 14, 15-year-old kids and say, don't you forget, for these people who were slaughtered, who escaped catastrophe, they want to be where you are. And think about that as you progress in your life. So really, in the context of North American, child of survivor, etc., I think as a child of a survivor, look, I look at my mother's presentations that she did in her Polish scripted English or whatever, it can really have flowing. She always ended it with God bless America. Every presentation she did, and you know what I do with my presentations? I say, this is what my mother would say, and I end it with God bless America.
What common traits have you found among fellow second generation Holocaust survivors?
Common traits. Here's what one of the things that I've found. First of all, I'm a middle child. I suspect there are a few of you on live stream who are middle children. You all are. I think the oldest of survivor children, many who were born in displaced persons camps, they're like at a different level of being a child of a survivor, because their passports, or if you will, their naturalization papers stamp Germany, to the extent that they were born, many of them, in Germany or what was occupied Germany at the time. So there's a matter of degree. And then, as I mentioned earlier, one child, one parent versus two parents. But, I think it's also really important when we're thinking about children of survivors. They mirror some of their own parents' pecking order. So for my mother, it's in the book. When we first moved to Detroit, I brought him to the synagogue we belonged to. And there was a man there who was a survivor. And of course, my mother, by the way, talked. A lot of survivors don't talk. My mother was willing to talk because the silence scared her more than the talk. And after shul, after services, she met with Walter, his first name was, and they were saying, "Oh, hi, I'm Polish, you're Polish. Where were you?" Okay. Walter asked my mother, "Where were you?" She says, "I was at Skarżyska, summer camp. I survived the Warsaw camp." It's like there's a pecking order of pain among survivors. And what I found is among children, when I've met children of survivors, many times they'll say, "Oh, where was your mother?" "Oh, well, not in my case, my mother's in Skarżyska, but Gina, my wife, her mother was on the kinder transport." Okay, Kristallnacht, shortly thereafter, among the 10,000 who went to England for the war. So my contemporaries, many of our contemporaries, they would kind of say, "That really being a survivor?" etc. So there is that added dynamic when it comes to being a child of a survivor. It's not kind of all this and none of that. You still have shades of pain. Birth order matters. Because by the time my sister would say, she was born in 1958, she pretty much did whatever she wanted. For the firstborn, as my mother said, she's living through her children. She's living through my brother. I'm living for her little brother who never survived. So I think it varies in every household.
Put two questions here together, following up on traits. One, did you grow up in a community where you had knowledge of, or there was a community of survivors? Is one, and did your mother have issues with food? Example, hoarding. I am a 2G and my parents amassed canned food. I am also from New Haven, and I remember shopping at your parents' store.
No, that's a challenge. Well, let's kind of focus on food, because Jewish food really matters. Food was very, very important in our household. My mother had a little challenge because she was not a great cook. I mean, she ended up making things that were passable, but she was not a great cook. But she would introduce not what you think she would introduce, because first of all, little segue, but my baby teeth were really rotten. I ended up wearing these silver caps to protect them. I look more grena than the grenas. With silver caps, they can have gold caps. The reason I had silver caps was I wouldn't swallow the food. I didn't like it. I ended up with these chipmunk cheeks all the time. Somehow she wouldn't notice, as long as it was off the plate. I find a reason to go in the bathroom and spit it all out. Okay? Food was important. But if I didn't eat, she would say, you know what? There are children starving in India. India. She didn't say, at that moment, I would have given my whatever. Later on, when it came to things like, I don't feel well, I'm not going to school. And my mother would say, I'd be shocked if I didn't get up every day. You're going to school. Or if I say, oh, well, I don't like corn. You don't like corn. I guess I'm done. I don't like corn. She said, pigs used to eat corn in Poland. I would have jumped into the trot and ate any ear of corn I could have found. So food very much was an important part of that story. And as it related to, let's see, shopping in New Haven, I hope my father gave her a good mitzvah, gave her a good deal. And
I think this will be our last question, which is, what do you hope readers will take away from your story?
What I hope readers take away from the story is, first of all, this isn't the sorrow and the pity, if you will. This isn't a blow by blow, here are all the terrible things that were done. They're terrible things that were done. It's a story of survival. It's a story of commitment. It's a story of generational responsibility. It's a story of speaking up and speaking out when you see injustice. And it's a story that hopefully encourages 2Gs, children of survivors. I'll give you the pen. I'll give you the pad. Write it down. Grandchildren of survivors. Ask your parents. Get the video camera out, or whatever piece of technology is appropriate for these times. Because if we don't tell our own stories, if we don't add those truths to the ones that our parents or grandparents witnessed, nobody else will. And God knows we need those now more than ever.
Thank you. Thank you for telling the story. Thank you for the book. For those of you at home, Dual Identities, Living in Meier's Shadow by Arthur Horwitz. Again, there's a book signing following this out front. And thank you for an amazing presentation and an important story for both the next generations and for those of us who were lucky enough not to have family murdered in the Holocaust or survivors, because it's important to understand what that impact is from generation to generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.